Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to talk about using the dynamic effort method with tactical operators. So last week, we talked about using the maximal effort method, which is where you pick a variation of a squat, bench, or deadlift, or an overhead press, whatever movement you want, and then work up to a top single. And it's for the purpose of developing force production, right? So how much force someone can actually produce. Today, we're going to talk about the dynamic effort method, which is essentially the opposite. So what I mean by that is where maximal effort is focused on producing force, the dynamic effort method is focused on rate of force development. So with the maximal effort method, we use that as our foundation for force production. How much force can we produce? How strong can we get? How strong are we? Etc. With the dynamic effort method, we move like one step up the pyramid, or up the performance hierarchy, however you want to phrase it. And we take that that capacity for force production and we apply it to how fast can we develop that force. So how quickly can we go from A to B, right? Or from A to B in squat or deadlift or jump or clean or whatever it may be, right? So, so again, force production versus rate of force development, two very important key concepts that are very on the surface, pretty interchangeable. Very interrelated, but very different at the same time. So why is it important that tactical operators utilize the dynamic effort method in their training? So to provide a little bit of context, a little bit of background, so the dynamic effort method as it is applied to powerlifting, which is where most of the conjugate method focus and prioritization and application lies, is about how fast can we move the barbell, right? Because especially at maximal weights, the faster you can move the barbell, the more force you can develop, or the greater the rate at which you can develop force. Sorry, it is 5:25. I'm barely awake, so here we are. So the greater rate at which you can produce or develop force, the more likely you are to be successful in the execution of the lift. So that's in powerlifting, right? But that's specific to that sport. For operators, I use the dynamic effort method in two capacities. One, yes, their capacity to develop force, the rate at which they can develop force. Because not only is it important that they are strong, but it is important that they're explosive, they're aggressive, and they're intentional with their movements, right? And so if we can teach them from both a psychological and a physiological perspective of how to develop force at a high rate, they should be, in theory, from a physical perspective, from a physical output perspective, be more successful and more powerful, aggressive, intentional, faster or quicker even. And then the second reason that I use, or the second method in which I use the dynamic effort method, is development of work capacity. So in the book of methods, I think one of the base templates for dynamic effort method, especially in the squat, is like a 3-week wave. 12 by 2 at 50%, 10 by 2 at 55%, and 8 by 2 at 60%, plus 25% accommodating resistance. Now, accommodating resistance, what is that, right? I don't think I've talked about that. I've talked about putting bands and chains on the bar, but I haven't really sat down and talked about accommodating resistance yet. So accommodating resistance is essentially a means or a method of applying additional tension or weight to the bar, or resistance to the bar, that adapts to the strength curve, right? So from a mechanical perspective, if we are at the bottom end of our, let's say the bottom end of our squat, we're in the hole on the squat, we're at the lowest point, that is our most mechanically disadvantageous position. We are weakest and most compromised in that position from a structural and a mechanical perspective, right? Think about joint angles, think about tension across the muscular system, positioning, posture, all that kind of stuff. That is where we're most vulnerable. At the top, that is where we are strongest, because if we're looking at it again from a structural perspective, our joints are stacked, muscles are engaged, we have tension throughout the system, we have holistic engagement, all that kind of stuff, right? So the question is, how do we overload the top end? How do we allow for additional rate of force development through the range of motion? Because, and the reason I bring that up is because when you lift something, so I'll go back to the squat, right? When you lift something, when you stand up, with a barbell on your back, your body has to naturally, whether you're conscious of it or not, is naturally going to decelerate. So it's going to slow down. Otherwise, you become ballistic and you leave the floor, right? So how do we then continue to teach continued rate of force development and continued force application to a lift or to a movement without going ballistic and leaving the floor, which is really not our intent, right? So Louis Simmons of Westside, he came across the utilization of chains and bands, which as the strength curve shifts, or as the strength curve increases, the accommodating resistance matches the curve, or pushes the curve essentially. So I'm getting nerdy here and I apologize. So basically what happens is when you put bands or chains on the bar, it lets you to continue to accelerate all the way through your lift without slowing down or with minimal deceleration. Because with chains, again, I talked about chains being a static load where they just hang from the barbell, right? Chains, as you stand up, each link comes off the floor and it incrementally increases weight as you stand up through the range of motion. So you have a greater amount of weight at the top of the repetition as compared to the bottom. Same concept with bands, except that bands are more dynamic as compared to static, because bands want to return to their natural shape. They want to return to their natural state and size and length. And so they are actively and dynamically pulling you back down, right? So bands are more aggressive, and bands can, in theory, produce a greater training effect, but they can also be more traumatic and more difficult to recover from, et cetera, et cetera. So that's accommodating resistance in a nutshell. You can use varying degrees thereof, varying percentages. You can use accommodating resistance in the max effort method, in the dynamic effort method, and in the repetition effort method. It just depends on what you want and how you want to apply it and what you're trying to chase. But with the dynamic effort method, so again, we operate in 3-week waves, 50, 55, and 60% plus 25% accommodating resistance. And that is of your 1 rep max with that given variation. So typically the way that I will program stuff out is at the beginning of a cycle, this is for operators, not for powerlifters, but for operators at the beginning of a 9 to 12 week cycle, we'll test our 1 rep max in squat and deadlift and in bench. So we'll establish some baselines. And then we'll use that number. So let's say I squat 405, right? We'll use that number to base all of our dynamic effort method percentages off. So I can't do math, right? 50, 55, and 60% escape me. So let's call 50% of 405, 200, right? It's like 202.5, but we can't do an individual 2.5, so it's 200 pounds, right? So week 1, I would do 200 pounds plus 25%, so that's 100. So 300 pounds total weight at the top of the repetition, whether it's through bands or through chains. Now bands are variable because bands are subject to lengthening and they have variable resistance. So like a taller person is going to get more tension out of the same band that a shorter person is using, and vice versa. Also bands will stretch over time. So you may have one band that is a little bit older, one band that is newer, and so you get more tension on one side as compared to the other. So bands can be a little bit finicky. But I have found that with operators, it's really not that important, that unless the bands are completely lopsided, like one is way stronger than the other, it's really not that important, because at the end of the day, it's not about the numbers and the percentages and the actual, like, the prescription of values, but it is about the effort, the intensity, and the methodology, the reasoning behind why you're doing and what you're trying to get out of it, right? So it's your why, it's your what and your why that really matters, not so much the nuances of, well, this is like 20% accommodating resistance versus 25% and yada, 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 right? So again, at the end of the day, it's just about output. How fast can we move the barbell? With what degree of severity and aggressiveness and violence can we move the barbell, with the intention of teaching both the mind and the body and the operator as a holistic unit to move something aggressively, or to move his or her body through space aggressively. And that's what it's all about, right? I've waxed poetic and I've waxed tangential for the last 5 minutes about all this stuff, but at the end of the day, it's like, how do we get you to move aggressively? How do we get you to take all the force that we've learned how to produce via the max effort method and make you apply it quickly, right? So that's the dynamic effort method in a nutshell. So with squat, so typically on a dynamic effort lower day, we'll do squat and we'll do deadlift, right? So squat, again, runs in a 3-week wave, 50, 55, and 60, 12 by 2, 10 by 2, 8 by 2, respectively. Whereas deadlift runs in another 3-week wave that is complementary to squat. So again, it goes 50, 55, and 60, but it's 10 by 1, 10 by 1, and 8 by 1, right? And so the volume is relatively the same across squat and deadlift, by a few repetition difference, but not too significantly. And The reasoning for doubles and singles is because, again, the conjugate method was made popular through powerlifting, right? And so Louis determined that a double, so doing 2 repetitions in a row, is relatively approximate to the amount of time that it takes to execute a true competition squat, right? So you can do a double in the same amount of time it takes you to do a single in competition. So it's, mimicking the time under tension, doubling the workload essentially, or doubling the volume, maybe not the workload, but doubling the volume. But again, mimicking the same amount of time that it takes to execute a given or a standard or an average 1 rep max in a competition. Same thing with deadlifts, right? In deadlifts, you just stand up with it, you put it back down, you're done, right? So there's no point in pulling doubles because you're just doing 1 effort, and deadlift typically takes less time to execute than a squat, especially in multiply, because you don't have as much gear on, you don't have to get wrapped up and squat to depth, you just bend down, pick the bar up, and stand up with it, right? But again, that's all powerlifting. Training with tactical operators is different methodology, or same methodology, different reasoning, different rationale. Now, so that's dynamic effort lower. There's also dynamic effort upper, which I go back and forth on using, because there's a couple different ways that I look at it. So a dynamic effort lower day is a much more systemically intense training methodology or training session or training exposure than is dynamic effort upper. So dynamic effort upper is like bench or floor press. You could do overhead press. You could do some Olympic variation if you want. It just depends on, again, the context within which you're operating. But all that being said, if you spend a whole session doing 24 reps on squat and 10 reps, so you're doing 34 total reps with your dynamic effort lower versus like a standard 9x3 on your max effort or your dynamic effort upper, like, yes, you're actually doing greater volume on your dynamic effort upper, but you're doing far less work because, and again, this is the way that it's written out in the book of methods, and this is the way that it's been written out pretty consistently, is that in your bench, instead of using a 3-week wave of 50, 55, and 60, you stay at 35% for 9 sets of 3, but you rotate your grips. So you do 3 sets of 3 close grip, 3 sets of 3 medium grip, and 3 sets of 3 wide grip at 35% plus 25% accommodating resistance via either bands or chains. So you're doing more volume typically in a given exercise. So if I'm doing 9x3, I'm doing 27 reps. If I'm doing 12x2 on my squat, I'm doing 24 reps. But then you also got to factor in the fact that you're doing an additional 10 repetitions with your deadlift, and you're not doing an additional 10 repetitions probably with your dynamic effort upper. Also, because it's limited to the bench press or the floor press or mostly an upper body dominant movement, the dynamic effort upper is not as, in my opinion, as effective as the dynamic effort lower for creating a holistic systemic training stimulus. So all that being said, I have used and I continue to use a traditional 9x3 rotating grip versus bands or chains, dynamic effort upper method. But I've started to gravitate away from that because I find that doing something with like volume, like true straight weight volume, is a little more effective because we're developing some work capacity and we're developing hypertrophy. We're also developing confidence underneath the barbell. So we'll do like a 6x6 wave, and then when they fail, we'll roll back and do an 8x8. When they fail that, we roll back and do a 10x10 or something like that. At least that's the theory, right? 10x10 takes a long time to do. So it just depends on your situation, how much time you have, and all that kind of stuff. But there is also value, and all this has "it depends" attached to it, right? So there is value, in my opinion, with teaching operators how to utilize the dynamic effort, especially the dynamic effort method appropriately, because if we teach somebody how to move a weight quickly, right, that could theoretically, hypothetically, potentially translate over to a max effort movement. So if we're moving 225 as our max effort upper, and on cycle 1, week 1, we move it this fast, but on cycle 2, we move it this fast, we become more powerful, right? And so we've trained our body to develop force at a much greater rate to match our capacity to produce force. And so what then could happen is that can translate into additional gains or additional pounds put on the bar with your max effort method. So it's kind of this give and take. It's kind of this like, well, what's really important here? Is it important that we teach somebody how to move a barbell very quickly? Or is it important that we teach somebody how to move explosively? And that's for dynamic effort. For max effort method, it's like, do I care how much you actually bench, or do I just care about the fact that you are learning to produce maximal force every single time? And am I trying to chase a number, or am I trying to chase and pursue just actual output? So all that being said, sometimes I stick with the traditional 9x3. Especially, I pretty much stick with bench press because it's just the easiest to set up, whether it's bands or chains. You don't have to lay on the floor. You don't have to worry about, like, how do I set up bands while I'm on the floor? Do I have to press inside of a rack? Like, blah, 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 right? It's just easy to lay on the bench press, slap bands or chains on the bar, and go for it. But we also use essentially the repetition effort method with upper body to create some additional volume and some hypertrophy, and some time under tension and some GPP. So the dynamic effort method can also be applied to like jumps, throws, Olympic movements, that kind of stuff, because again, it is just the rate of force development. It's not force production. So we're not looking at how much force we can produce. We're not looking at how strong we can be. We're looking at how powerful and explosive we can be. So I love using jumps as both like part of a warm-up and as a precursor to dynamic effort work, especially for the lower body. Like we'll do broad jump variations, we'll do box jump variations, we'll do seated jump variations. And then for upper body, we'll do variations of throws or like med ball slams, something to, at least in theory, right, get the nervous system primed and activated and ready to go and ready to, produce the force that we need to for max effort, or operate at the rate or at the degree to which we need for our dynamic effort method. So dynamic effort method, especially lower, can be a very effective way of developing work capacity, because again, this is from the book of methods and from Louis', talks and writings and all that kind of stuff, that you want to keep your work to rest ratio relatively 1-to-1, okay, or relatively low. So what I mean by that is, like, if we do 12 sets of 2, with my guys, I give them 6 seconds to execute 2 repetitions. Most people fall within that. Some people are like 7 or 8 seconds, but again, there's always gonna be some variation, but I wanna give them 6 seconds is a very achievable, very executable amount of time to do 2 repetitions in, especially if you're pushing fast. And again, that's the whole point. So we truncate the amount of available time to try to inflate or try to push the degree to which they are developing force, right? And then I give them like 30 seconds between sets. So it's a very short rest period. So your heart rate stays high, your breathing stays high, your arousal stays pretty high. You don't get a chance to like down regulate and then ramp back up. Like you have to stay pretty elevated the whole time. And 50%, 12x2, it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have 30 seconds in between each set, it's quite a bit. So like that's, it's 60 seconds. So it's, that's 6 minutes, not 60 seconds, right? So if it's 30 seconds per set or between each set, that's 6 minutes. And then 6 seconds across 12 sets, that's, 72 seconds. So it's basically, you're looking at like 7 to 8 minutes worth of work in just the squat, but you're achieving 24 repetitions within that 7 to 8 minutes. So you're accumulating quite a bit of volume and fatigue inside of a pretty short amount of time. And the same thing with the deadlift. I do 10 sets of 1 for week 1, 10 sets of 1 for week 2, and 8 sets of 1 for week 3. But again, with that 30-second rest interval between each set. So again, high intensity by virtue of low rest periods. Not high intensity from a true intensity perspective, like a percentage-based perspective, but high intensity from a rest period perspective. Again, it is 5:41 now, and my brain is still not turned on. I need way more caffeine and way more calories to function today. So that's about it as far as the dynamic effort method. And again, why do I use it with my operators? Well, it depends, right? Because I want them to be able to develop force quickly. I want them to be able to move explosively and aggressively. So like, think about running from cover to cover, right? If you're in a firefight and you need to move from point A to point B, we don't want to move slowly, right? We want to move quickly. And so that's why we teach the brain and the body how to develop force at a high rate, and then we pair it with jumps and throws and sprints so that we actually have real world appropriate application of this trait that we're developing, right? Because none of this means anything if it doesn't apply to the real world and to what these guys do, right? So if you can squat, 400 or 500 pounds, but you're not very fast and you're trying to move from cover to cover in a firefight, you're vulnerable, right? Yes, I want you to be as strong as you can be, but I also want you to be as explosive as possible. Because like this, the operator needs, sort of a whole holistic, all-encompassing approach to physical performance. And there's always gonna be guys who are faster and stronger or have greater endurance or whatever than somebody else, right? And that's just the nature of humanity and physiology and all that kind of stuff, right? But if we can try to provide and try to help create the most holistic package that we can for an operator, the more likely he is to see success. And now this can apply, so I'm basically talking about the military here, right? But this can apply to, law enforcement officers. This can apply to firefighters, EMTs, first responders. Again, the stronger you are through max effort, the better not the better you are, but like the better your performance is going to be. From a physical perspective, from a tactical, technical perspective, that's an entirely different story, right? But the more capable you are going to be physically as you grow stronger. As you grow more explosive, more aggressive, more intentional with your movement, again, that'll couple with your ability to produce force, and it'll make you a more effective, from again, a physical perspective, not a tactical or technical perspective, but from a physical perspective, it'll make you a more effective operator, whether military, law enforcement, or first responder. There are different ways that you can execute the dynamic effort method, especially lower. I've done 5x5s. I've done 6x3s. I've done, so it's important to play around with things and find what works for you. So if you're doing your own programming, like find what works for you. And if that's a 5x5, it's more time under tension per set. I mean, it's relatively the same amount of volume, right? So a 12x2 is 24 repetitions. A 5x5 is 25 repetitions. So you have roughly the same amount of volume across the entirety of the work session or the training session, but your per set volume is higher with your 5x5, so you have more time under tension per set. So more fatigue accumulation, more requisite adherence to technique and form and all that kind of stuff. So it's just important to find what works for you. And then if you're a coach, find what works best for your operators or your athletes, right? So feel free to experiment a little bit. Like, yes, Louis has written down in the book of methods and like squat manuals and deadlift manuals and bench manuals, like this is how you do X, Y, or Z. But that's based on his experiences with his population, right? And I think the beauty of the conjugate method is that it is, malleable and it is fluid and dynamic. And as long as you adhere to the main principles and the main sort of tenets of max effort, dynamic effort, repetition effort method, and follow those things, you'll be successful really no matter how you apply it. To a degree. Right, you can't go like 10x10 on dynamic effort lower and expect to be successful because that's a shit ton of volume at a relative intensity and all that kind of stuff. But you get my point. So anyway, I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you for checking in. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. And as always, do not waste the pain.